dust tastes like chalk and old pennies. It coated Carmela's teeth every time the medevac choppers roared overhead, vibrating the reinforced aluminum ribs of the surgical tent. You don't get used to it. You just learn to chew it while you're tying off a shattered artery. The water from the scrub sink was strictly rationed, lukewarm, and smelled aggressively of chlorine. Carmela worked the abrasive sponge under her fingernails, watching the suds turn a faint, rusty pink before spiraling down the metal drain. She didn't look at the clock. Time in the trauma bay didn't exist in hours or minutes. It existed in surges. A surge of rotors, a surge of screaming, a surge of frantic, bloody mechanical work. And then, the hollow, ringing quiet. Right now, they were in the quiet. Carmela grabbed a coarse paper towel and dried her hands. Her scrubs, heavily starched with dried sweat and God knew what else, scraped stiffly against the back of her knees as she walked. The linoleum floor was sticky. It always was, no matter how much bleach the orderlies dumped on it. She walked over to bed for Corporal Jacob Reardon, 19 years old, though the dirt and exhaustion ground into his face made him look 30. He had taken a piece of mortar shrapnel through the meaty part of his left thigh. It missed the femoral artery by an inch, a miracle measured in millimeters. Now he was pumped full of morphine, staring at the canvas ceiling with wide, unblinking eyes. The heavy vinyl flaps of the tent entrance tore open, letting in a blinding slice of desert sunlight and the thick smell of burning diesel. Commander Tommy Stone stepped inside. He took up too much space. It wasn't just his height, though he was tall, broad-shouldered, and rigid in his dirt-caked fatigues. It was the way he carried himself. Infantry commanders always walked into the medical tent like they were inspecting a conquered territory, masking their deep, primal discomfort with unearned authority. He held a battered styrofoam cup in his right hand. A thin ribbon of steam curled from the top, carrying the acrid scent of mess hall coffee that had been boiling on a hot plate since 0400. Stone's eyes scanned the room, skipping over the empty beds, the monitors, the tangled IV lines, until they landed on Reardon. His jaw tightened. He strode over, his heavy combat boots squeaking awkwardly on the tacky linoleum. Carmela didn't look up from Reardon's chart. She simply stepped half a pace to the side, giving the commander access to his marine, but keeping her hand on the IV drip. "Corporal," Stone said. His voice was a gravelly baritone, engineered to carry over gunfire, but here, in the hum of the fluorescent lights, it just sounded loud. Reardon blinked slowly, his head lolling to the side. "Sir." The word slurred, thick and heavy. "My leg's still there." "It's there, son," Stone said. He forced a tight, reassuring smile. "Doc says you get a few weeks of rack time, then you're back on your feet. You did good out there." Reardon offered a weak nod, his eyes already drifting shut again as the narcotics pulled him under. Stone stood there for a moment, the artificial smile slowly melting off his face. The fatigue underneath was profound. Carmela saw it in the grey bags under his eyes, the deep lines bracketing his mouth. He was responsible for 200 men, and today he had brought 3 of them back in pieces. He turned his attention to Carmela. She was currently adjusting the clear plastic tubing of Reardon's IV, her movements economical and entirely silent. She didn't wear a rank insignia on her scrub top, just a piece of white medical tape over her left breast with Rivera scrawled in black Sharpie. Stone took a sip of his coffee. He winced as the scalding, bitter liquid hit his tongue. He needed to talk. People like Stone always needed to fill the silence to keep the ghosts at bay. "You docs do good work," Stone said, shifting his weight. "I'm a nurse, Commander," Carmela replied, her voice flat. She didn't offer her rank. She didn't offer a smile. She just checked the clamp on the line. Stone leaned against the metal railing of the bed, trying to project a casual confidence that didn't reach his eyes. He watched her work. He noticed the way she moved. No wasted energy, no hesitation. She seemed entirely detached from the humanity of the boy bleeding on the cot, treating him like a complicated engine that needed a tune-up. It unnerved him. "You've got quiet hands," Stone observed. He gestured with his styrofoam cup. "Been watching you since I walked in. You don't make a sound. You don't slam drawers. You don't curse at the orderlies. You're practically invisible." Carmela finally looked at him. Her eyes were a pale, washed-out hazel, completely devoid of whatever deference he was used to receiving. "The machines make enough noise, sir. I don't need to add to it." Stone chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He was trying to establish a rapport, trying to find some common ground in this sterilized pocket of hell. He leaned in just a fraction, falling back on the easy, sarcastic banter that sustained the infantry. "I bet the guys have a name for that," Stone said, a crooked half-smile playing on his lips. "You guys have call signs in here, right? What's yours, sweetheart? The Phantom?" Carmela felt a dull ache behind her temples. The casual misogyny of sweetheart barely even registered anymore. It was the joke that grated on her. The assumption that everything out here was a game of cool nicknames and bravado. She capped her pen and clipped it to her V-neck. She looked dead at him. "They call me Ghost Lady, Commander." Stone let out a short, sharp laugh. He took another sip of his terrible coffee. "Ghost Lady," Stone repeated, rolling the words around. "Spooky. What, you sneak up on the surgeons and steal their scalpels? Haunt the latrines?" He was smiling, waiting for her to break, waiting for the cynical camaraderie of a shared joke. Carmela didn't smile. She stared at the center of his chest, her expression utterly blank. From the bed, a raspy, drug-heavy voice broke the tension. "It's not a joke, sir." Stone snapped his head down. Reardon was awake again. The young corporal's face was slick with a cold sweat, but his eyes were suddenly, fiercely lucid. He looked at his commander, then at Carmela, and finally back to Stone. "Don't joke about that, sir," Reardon breathed, wincing as a phantom pain shot through his bandaged leg. Stone frowned, his forced joviality vanishing. He stood up straight. "Easy, Corporal. Just making conversation." "It's not 'cause she's quiet." Reardon forced the words out, his chest heaving under the thin cotton blanket. He swallowed dryly. "It's the tags, sir." Stone furrowed his brow. "Tags?" Carmela stepped in, moving to pull the blanket higher over Reardon's chest. "That's enough, Corporal. Save your strength. The morphine makes them talkative," she added, shooting a cold, dismissive glance at Stone. "If you're done checking on your man, Commander, I have other patients." But Stone wasn't an idiot. He had been in combat zones long enough to recognize the sudden, heavy shift in the atmosphere. The air in the bay had gone dense. "What tags, Reardon?" Stone ordered, his voice dropping into the unquestionable cadence of command. Reardon swallowed again. He looked at Carmela, almost apologetically, before speaking. "Triage tags, sir. Green, yellow, red." Reardon paused, his breathing ragged. "And black." Stone's grip on the styrofoam cup tightened. He knew standard medical doctrine. He knew the triage system. Green was walking wounded. Yellow was delayed. Red was immediate. The ones who were bleeding out but could be saved if the surgeons worked fast enough. And black. Black meant expectant. It was the coldest, most brutal mathematics of war. When a mass casualty event happened, resources were finite, blood was finite, surgeon hands were finite. If a Marine came in with injuries too catastrophic, missing limbs, missing half their face, brain matter exposed, and their chances of survival were effectively zero, they were tagged black. They were pushed aside so the medics could save the red tags. They were expected to die. "They put 'em behind the curtain," Reardon whispered, staring up at the ceiling, lost in the memory of the triage floor during a mortar attack last month. The expectant, in the corner, behind the heavy canvas curtain. So the guys who can live don't have to watch 'em die." Stone stood frozen. The ambient noise of the trauma bay, the hum of the lights, the beep of the monitors, seemed to rush away, leaving a ringing silence in his ears. He looked at Carmela. She was standing perfectly still, her hands thrust deep into the pockets of her scrubs. She wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at the floor. "The docs don't go back there," Reardon continued, his voice cracking. "Medics don't go back there. They can't. They gotta save the Reds." Reardon turned his head, his bleary eyes locking onto Stone's. "But she goes back there, sir." Stone felt a cold spike of dread drive itself down his spine. He looked at the white tape on her chest. Rivera. He looked at her hands, still jammed into her pockets. "When the choppers drop a black tag," Reardon said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "Lieutenant Rivera goes behind the curtain. She sits on the dirt. She holds their hands." Reardon's eyes filled with sudden, unbidden tears. "She talks to 'em, lies to 'em, tells 'em they're going home, tells 'em their mums are waiting." Carmela closed her eyes. A muscle in her jaw jumped. "Corporal, stop!" Reardon ignored her. He was speaking directly to his commanding officer now, stripping away the armor of rank and bravado. "She sits in the dark with the dead, sir. She becomes a ghost, so they don't have to be alone when it happens. She's the last thing they see." Reardon's head fell back against the pillow, exhausted by the effort. "That's why they call her the Ghost Lady." The silence that followed was suffocating. Stone stood paralyzed beside the bed. His mind, usually sharp and tactical, short-circuited. He saw the faces of the 3 Marines he had lost today. Private Jenkins, Lance Corporal Vance. No, he couldn't think of their names. He saw the boys he had ordered into the choke point. He saw the blood soaking the sand. And then he saw this nurse. This tired, cynical woman with stained cuticles and unwashed hair, sitting on a dirt floor behind a canvas curtain, holding the torn, bloody hand of an 18-year-old kid who was bleeding out in the dark because Stone's orders had put him there. He had asked her if she snuck up on surgeons. He had called her sweetheart. A massive, crushing weight dropped onto Stone's chest. His breathing hitched. He stared at Carmela, trying to find words, trying to formulate an apology, a justification, anything to fill the yawning, terrible silence. But his hands betrayed him first. As the realization of her grim, solitary duty fully washed over him, Stone's right hand clamped down in a sudden, involuntary spasm of raw grief and horror. The cheap styrofoam cup couldn't hold the pressure. With a sharp crack, the side of the cup split wide open. The lid popped off. Boiling, black coffee erupted over Stone's knuckles, burning his skin, but he barely felt it. The cup slipped from his trembling grip. It hit the linoleum floor with a heavy, wet smack. Brown liquid exploded outward, splashing across the toes of Stone's tan combat boots, pooling around the tacky rubber soles of Carmela's shoes. The steam rose from the puddle, mixing the smell of burnt coffee with the pervasive scent of bleach and iodine. Stone stared at the spilled coffee. He couldn't look up. His chest heaved. The imposing, untouchable USMC Commander was entirely disassembled by a piece of styrofoam and a plastic tag the color of pitch. Carmela looked down at the mess on the floor. She watched the dark liquid crawl towards the drain. She didn't feel vindicated. She didn't feel victorious. She just felt deeply, profoundly tired. She pulled her hands out of her pockets and grabbed a wad of coarse paper towels from the dispenser on the wall. She walked over to Stone, who was still staring blankly at the floor, his hand dripping hot coffee. She pressed the dry towels into his chest. "Clean it up, Commander," Carmela said softly, her voice carrying no malice, only the hollow exhaustion of someone who lived permanently on the edge of the grave. "We don't have janitors here, and I have to get back to work." She turned her back on him, walking towards the heavy canvas curtain at the far end of the bay. A new chopper was already vibrating the walls. Paper towels dissolved almost instantly against the hot linoleum, turning into useless grey mush. Commander Tommy Stone knelt awkwardly in the center of the trauma bay, his heavily starched uniform pants soaking up the spilled coffee and the residual bleach from the floor. He scraped the wet paper into a pile, ignoring the stinging burn on his knuckles. He needed the menial task. His brain, rigidly wired for tactical overviews and casualty radiuses, was currently trapped in a freefall. Scrubbing the sticky floor gave his hands something to do, an anchor against the rising tide of bile in his throat. Above them, the corrugated tin roof of the medical tent began to rattle. It started as a low, throbbing vibration in the back of the teeth, quickly escalating into a deafening roar. Dust and fine sand shook loose from the canvas seams, drifting down in the fluorescent light like dirty snow. The medevac was landing on the pad outside. Stone tossed the sodden paper towels into a biohazard bin. He stood up, wiping his wet hands on his pants. The air pressure in the room shifted violently as the heavy outer flaps were ripped open. The quiet was gone. 4 medics burst through the threshold, boots sliding on the grit. They were hauling 2 collapsible canvas litters. The smell hit the room before the stretchers even parked. A dense, sickening wall of scorched nylon, diesel fuel, and the distinct coppery tang of ruptured human anatomy. "Double-amp amputee, traumatic. Tourniquets placed at 1400. He's crashing!" A medic yelled, his voice cracking from sand and adrenaline. Carmela was already moving. The exhaustion that had weighed down her shoulders only seconds ago vanished, replaced by a terrifying, mechanical efficiency. She didn't run. Running caused panic. She glided to the first litter, a pair of trauma shears already out and snapping through the thick fabric of a Marine's uniform. Stone stepped back, pressing his shoulders against the vibrating wall of the tent. He was completely useless here. In the field, he was a god who called down airstrikes. In this room, he was just a traffic hazard. He watched Carmela work. A doctor, a frantic man with sweat soaking through his paper cap, shouted for O negative. Carmela had the bag spiked, and the line flushed before the echo of his voice faded. She found a vein in a collapsed, dirt-caked arm entirely by feel, slipping the needle in without breaking eye contact with the heart monitor. Then the second stretcher was wheeled in. The medic pushing it wasn't yelling. He was just pushing. His face was a pale, chalky mask. Stone looked down at the litter. It was Private First Class Benjamin Todd. Todd was a radio man. He was barely 20 years old, a kid from somewhere in Ohio who had spent the last 3 weeks complaining about the lack of decent hot sauce in the MREs. Now, Todd was a ruined landscape of flesh. Shrapnel had shredded his flak jacket. His breathing was wet and ragged, a horrific sucking sound coming from somewhere deep in his chest. His eyes were wide, darting frantically around the bright lights, seeing nothing. The triage doctor stepped away from the first bed and walked over to Todd. He leaned in, pressing a stethoscope to the intact portion of Todd's chest, then checked the pulse at his carotid. The doctor's face remained entirely neutral. He pulled a small booklet of plastic tags from his pocket. He didn't hesitate. He didn't deliberate. He simply tore off the bottom tag, pitch black, looped the attached wire through the buttonhole of Todd's shredded collar, and twisted it tight. "Expectant," the doctor muttered, waving the orderlies away. "Move him to the back. We need the space. Get that chest tube ready for bed 1. Stone felt the air leave his lungs. It was one thing to know the doctrine. It was another entirely to watch a boy you commanded get written off with a piece of plastic and a twist tie. The orderlies grabbed the handles of Todd's stretcher. They didn't look at the boy's face. They steered him past the frantic, bloody chaos of the active bays, rolling him toward the far corner of the tent, toward the heavy canvas curtain. Stone's boots felt like they were cast in concrete, but some morbid, punishing gravity pulled him forward. He walked down the center aisle, dodging a nurse sprinting with a tray of clamps. He stopped about 10 feet from the curtain. It was thick, olive-drab material, stained with old iodine and dust, hanging from a metal track on the ceiling. From the corner of his eye, Stone saw movement. Carmela stepped away from the first bed. The doctor was elbow-deep in the patient's abdomen, shouting for suction. Carmela's part was done. The lines were in. The fluids were running. She wiped her gloved hands on a towel, pulled off the latex, and tossed it into a bin. She walked toward the back of the tent. She didn't look at Stone as she passed him. Her face was set in a hard, pale line. She reached the curtain, gripped the edge of the heavy fabric, and slipped behind it. Shadows dominated the space behind the curtain. The bright, clinical fluorescent lights of the trauma bay didn't penetrate here. It was lit only by a single, caged bulb hanging from a crossbeam, casting long, warped shadows against the fabric. It smelled worse back here. Without the sharp chemical bite of bleach to mask it, the scent of dying was overwhelming. It smelled like earth and sweat and profound bodily failure. Stone stood near the gap in the curtain. He didn't enter. He couldn't. But he couldn't look away either. He peered through the slit in the canvas, his heart hammering a dull, guilty rhythm against his ribs. Todd's stretcher had been lowered close to the floor, resting unevenly on the plywood floorboards. The boy was shivering violently. Carmela dragged a heavy, yellow plastic supply crate over to the side of the litter. She sat down. Her knees popped loudly in the quiet space, a sharp, grinding sound. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her thighs. Cold. Todd rattled, his jaw trembling so hard his teeth clicked. It's cold. It was 110 degrees outside. The tent was a sweltering oven. Carmela reached out. She didn't put on fresh gloves. Her bare hands, calloused and stained faint yellow from repeated iodine scrubbing, found Todd's trembling fingers. She gripped his hand firmly, pulling it against her stomach to share her body heat. I know, buddy, Carmela said softly. Her voice was entirely different now. Gone was the flat, cynical bark she used with Stone. Gone was the sharp, clipped tone she used with the surgeons. It was low, raspy, and deeply worn. A voice meant for a dark room. The AC is cranked too high in here. We'll get you a blanket in a second. Todd's chest heaved. Blood bubbled at the corner of his cracked lips. Doc put a tag on me. Am I... He couldn't finish the sentence. The terror in his eyes was completely unvarnished. He was looking at Carmela like she was the only anchor holding him to the earth. Stone watched Carmela's face. He expected her to flinch. He expected her to offer some hollow, pious comfort about God or country. Instead, Carmela lied with the smooth, practiced ease of a career criminal. You're red-tagged, Todd, she said, squeezing his hand. Means you get to cut the line. Chopper's spinning up outside to take you to Landstuhl. You're going to Germany. Then you're going home. Todd blinked. The frantic darting of his eyes slowed just a fraction. Home? Yeah, Carmela whispered. She reached into her scrub pocket with her free hand, pulled out a relatively clean piece of gauze, and gently wiped the bubbling blood from his mouth. You're getting a medical discharge. You're done with the dirt. Done with the MREs. Todd let out a breath that sounded like tearing wet paper. A faint, ghostly smile ghosted across his grey face. Hot sauce. Gonna get some real food. Whatever you want, Carmela said. She swallowed hard, an imperceptible movement, but Stone saw the slight shudder in her shoulders. Steak, burgers. Your mum's going to cook whatever you want. Mum, Todd whispered. His eyes drifted away from Carmela, staring past her, looking at the dark canvas wall as if it were a window. Tell her I kept my rifle clean. Stone squeezed his eyes shut. A sharp physical pain stabbed behind his sternum. I yelled at him for a speck of carbon on his bolt. Stone thought, the memory burning like acid. Yesterday. I told him he was a disgrace. She knows, Carmela murmured, rubbing her thumb over the back of Todd's knuckles. She's proud of you. Just rest now. Close your eyes. Flight's going to be a long one. Todd didn't close his eyes. They simply stopped moving. The wet, ragged breathing hitched once, rattled deep in his ruined chest, and then stopped entirely. The silence that rushed into the small space was absolute. Even the muted chaos from the trauma bay on the other side of the curtain seemed to fade away. Carmela didn't move immediately. She kept holding his hand. She sat perfectly still for 10 long seconds, just breathing in the stifling, copper-scented air. Then the facade dropped. Carmela let go of Todd's hand, crossing his arms over his chest. She scrubbed her hands over her face, dragging her fingers through her sweat-matted hair. She let out a long, shuddering exhale that sounded less like a sigh and more like a dry sob. But she didn't cry. There was no moisture left in her. There was only a profound, hollow exhaustion. She dug into her scrub pocket and pulled out a cheap plastic pen. She grabbed the black tag twisted onto Todd's collar. She checked the battered Casio watch strapped to her wrist, its screen scratched and smeared. 14:12. She scrawled the time of death onto the black plastic. Carmela pushed herself up from the plastic crate. Her back groaned. She grabbed a thin, white cotton sheet from a nearby supply rack and pulled it over Todd's face, covering the wide, unseeing eyes. When she turned around to push through the gap in the curtain, she stopped. Stone was standing right there. He didn't look like a commander anymore. His rigid posture was broken. His shoulders slumped, and his eyes were red-rimmed and staring at the white sheet. He looked like an old, beaten man. Carmela looked at him. She didn't offer comfort. She didn't offer a salute. She just looked at him with those pale, washed-out eyes, her face smeared with sweat and someone else's blood. They need you back in the bay, Ghost Lady. Stone whispered, the words scraping against his throat. It wasn't a joke this time. It was a title, heavy, bleak, earned. Carmela tucked her pen back into her V-neck. I know. She pushed past him, slipping through the heavy canvas flap, walking out of the dark and back into the screaming, bloody light. Stone stood alone in the shadows for a long time, the smell of burnt coffee finally fading beneath the heavy, permanent scent of the dust. If this story hit you in the chest, drop a like and hit subscribe. We bring you raw, unfiltered stories from the front lines of humanity, stories that skip the Hollywood gloss and show the real grit of the people in the shadows. Share this with someone who needs a reminder of what real, quiet sacrifice looks like. What did you think of Carmela's reaction? Let us know in the comments below. Keep watching, keep listening,